Okay, so welcome to our next Newcastle Youth Studies Centre seminar. And today we have Sam Kirwan, who's joining us here from the University of Bristol and is joining our centre for the next 8 weeks. So first, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge we are meeting on the lands of the Awabakal and Worimi peoples on this campus of the University of Newcastle, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And definitely pay respects to any First Nations people joining us today. So we'll get straight into it, Sam. Get you to talk about your topic that you're currently finishing off writing a book about. It speaks very much into the work we've been doing in the centre and financial practices and fintech. Talk for about half an hour-ish, whatever you need there, and then we'll take some questions at the end.
Lovely.
Okay,
thanks, Steve. Okay, thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Steve, and Newcastle Youth Study Centre for organising. As Steve says, that lots of the work that I've been doing over the past decade has a lot of crossovers with the projects that you've been doing here in the centre. There's not necessarily the same crossover in terms of young people. My focus is on, or I suppose it's actually a failure of the, not failure necessarily, but a missing point within the projects is the incorporation of changing financial practices, particularly changing gambling practices among young people. It's something I'm intensely aware of because of my own children. And I'm not going to expand on it very much, but just in a slightly anecdotal way, just speaking about gambling specifically, I cannot emphasize enough how much for a 14-year-old today, the gambling landscape, and particularly advertising landscape that they are engaging with, bears very little relation to what we would understand, so look to my camera, would understand as gambling or gambling advertising. So the actual practical projects that I've got 2 bits in at the moment, both of which are about developing materials for advice services to support the ways in which they engage with gambling, and trying to have a strong focus on young people for that reason. I think there are particularly thinking about gambling issues are enormously underserved, particularly when we're talking about gambling support and advice. And so that's my little bit about what's going to be missing from this talk, which is a focus on youth. But as you'll see, there are lots of crossovers when we're talking about financial subjectivity, algorithmic justice, a focus upon speculation, as I'll come on to. So this is what I'm going to talk through, are the kind of themes and fieldwork and ideas and theoretical background to the book I've been working on for a few years that is due to be released, or finished and released, fingers crossed, later this year or early next year. The title of which is The Debt Cycle: How Cashless Technologies Are Transforming Crime, Justice and Everyday Life. And you'll see there's criminological focus in the title. It is primarily pitching this as a text for criminology, but one that takes money seriously, which I think criminology tends not to do. And when I say take money seriously, I mean actually engage with how people relate to monies, plural, in everyday life, the ways in which particularly changing digital cashless technologies are changing the roles that money plays in mediating relationships, shaping and framing a kind of sense of the future and how the future feels, how that's mobilized in the present. So I think these are things that criminology has traditionally and continues to fail to do, to actually think about the role that money plays in everyday life. And my argument is that this plays a really key role, particularly as digital technologies, fintech is profoundly changing how we relate to money. This is having a really profound effect on these traditional subject matters of criminology, namely surveillance, punishment, behavioral control, and ultimately power, which is going to be a key theme that I'm going to talk about here. I think you'll probably have an idea of how each of these themes relates to financial technology, but I'm going to touch on in this talk a few key instances of financial surveillance. Actually, not going to talk about financial punishment so much, although it's a key theme, and you might know Cooper's piece from 2019 about financial punishment in Australia. But I'm going to talk a lot about behavioral control and power. So I'm going to talk about the projects that have fed into the book. I'm going to give some of the key background context that shaped those projects. I'm going to talk about the key theoretical frameworks that inform how it is that I'm approaching money and inform the arguments that I make regarding the changing role of digital monies in people's lives. I'm going to talk about three case studies. The first is going to be the use of digital technologies to restrict what money can be spent on, but particularly welfare benefits or social security monies. And the example I'm going to draw on quite heavily there is the Australian case of the cashless debit card scheme and Shelley Bielefeld's work on that. But there are kind of emergent moves in the UK towards a similar system of restricting I'm expanding a little bit here, I'm going to talk about that. But there are echoes of that scheme in other jurisdictions. I'm going to talk about what I said, communicating risk. What I mean is the changing nature of the determination of risk beyond the traditional form, which is credit referencing, and the kind of challenger or emergent forms of determining risk for the purposes of lending, but also sectors related to that, namely tenancies and employment as well, beyond the credit referencing sector, but particularly where these emergent forms incorporate a broader range of data, namely particularly communication data and other forms of financial data as well. And then I'm going to talk about gambling. And the gambling is less actually about specific case study than about the role that particularly online gambling plays in Australia and the United Kingdom particularly. I'm going to finish with a series of unresolved questions that I have that I'm kind of trying to work through at the moment, which are about the relationship between financial subjectivity. Who is it that citizens, we are intended to be or enticed into being? That there's a kind of dominant set of thoughts around that about the investor subject and this injunction to become kind of citizen investors. I'm really interested in the relationship of that financial subjectivity to gambling. Given that gambling is so dominant in the UK and Australia, how does that relate to this, desired government or this form of governmentality around the investor subject? How does that relate to gambling? And so I'm going to finish on some of those unresolved questions that I have. This book brings together a series of projects, the first two of which were focused on advice services, the latter of which, my early career fellowship, was focused upon debt advice specifically. And then over the last few years, I've had a series of projects that I've been doing about gambling. The first one about in-person bricks and mortar betting shops, and particularly machine gambling within betting shops. One about seaside towns, and one about the relationship between crypto investment and gambling. And it's the first of those that I'm going to be continuing whilst here in Newcastle, which I'm really excited about being here. And again, thank you, Steve and the Centre, for hosting me. A bit of context. So for a long time, I was volunteering within the Citizens Advice Service, doing participant ethnographies, whilst also writing about debt advice. In order to give some background to that period, 2013 to 2020, and the particular challenges that people were facing, which is going to lead into how those challenges are being transformed in the era of cashless societies. I'm going to give you a bit of context to the welfare benefits context and then the debt context in the United Kingdom in this period, which is actually quite a clean demarcation. It's the period between the kind of rolling out of austerity measures from the Welfare Reform Act 2013 through to the COVID pandemic, which I'm actually not sure the impact of that in Australia, but in the UK, the response of our administering welfare agency, the Department for Work and Pensions, was actually to suspend a lot of the conditional measures that had been brought into the welfare benefit system over the previous 2 decades. So it actually represented a lot of really positive changes, many of which were then rolled back in the years after it. The term austerity, I'm going to come back to austerity in the penultimate slide, Just to note that that term does hide the really significant kind of neo-paternalist reorganization of welfare benefits over this period, that austerity was not simply about simple cutting or rolling back of benefit levels, but a quite severe restructuring of what benefits were. And actually, I'm not sure if I've mentioned it, but I'm going to come on to the importance of Viviana Zalitzer in the book. But it entailed a really important reframing of what benefits money is, an important kind of cultural framing of benefits money as something that is dirty, that is unearned, is unclean, and to which, as I'll come on to in a moment, there's very little political pushback to doing things like restricting what it can be spent on. So just a couple of notes about what austerity in the welfare benefit system entailed: series of cuts, as I'm sure you know, an expansion of conditionality under the work programme. So, making benefits payments conditional upon undertaking certain tasks and keeping up with one's claimant's commitment. There was the child limit on the tax credits element that was very recently revoked. There was a benefits cap that limited the maximum amount that one could claim. That had a really profound effect upon people in expensive urban centres. There was a benefits freeze that reduced the real-term value. Those elements of austerity and welfare reform are very well known. The element that's far less well known and is only becoming a little bit more public now was the really aggressive approach that the new enforcement teams took to collecting overpayments, and particularly overpayments that were deemed to be fraudulent. So the new DWP teams took a far more liberal approach to what they could classify as fraudulent overpayments, and then took a far more punitive and aggressive approach to recouping those overpayments. So there was a whole new infrastructure was developed for when payments could be deducted, for example, from income, and also the other debts that could be deducted from payments. So I'm talking too much about that because I'm not going to expand upon it, but it's one of the very interesting intersections of welfare benefits and criminal justice, where the welfare benefit system increasingly resembles the criminal justice system, particularly in how it was going to recoup and enforce overpayments. This, as I say, this issue has become a little bit more public recently because of this, the newspaper cutting that I've got on the top of those two newspaper cuttings is from the Daily Mail, which is quite unusual. If you know the Daily Mail, they're very much a kind of right-wing newspaper in the UK. It is extremely unusual for the Daily Mail to be sticking up for people who have been prosecuted for welfare benefits fraud. In fact, this is the only example I know of where our right-wing press did actually present people as, again, investigated and prosecuted for welfare benefits fraud as vaguely human. Part of the reason for that was because they were carers. I mean, it really was an extraordinary story. These were people that had only gone like a couple of pence over their the limits on how much they were allowed to earn in order to claim carers allowance. It really hung on one particular case where a woman was prosecuted, and the prosecution service used the proceeds of Crime Act to recoup the inheritance that she gained from the person that she was caring for. So it really was an extraordinary case, but it marks the first time that there was some public knowledge of how aggressive the DWP were being in terms of investigating people for fraud and then aggressively recouping the money. Another point, to raise, the second one is far less known as a story, but one of the new teams within the DWP, there are big questions to be asked about how they are determining cases that are suspected of fraud, because Kate Osamor, the MP, raised the fact that almost all of the Bulgarian claimants in her constituency were suddenly having their claims suspended. And the suggestion was that they were running, kind of algorithmic determination of risk that was excluding or suspending people's claims based on their nationality. So if that's the kind of welfare benefits context, the debt context was very much shaped by two significant shifts. The first shift was away from consumer debts as the defining feature of people's lives, the thing that they were, the challenges that they were facing, were increasingly not to do with their consumer debts and rather focused upon their priority debts. So priority debts in advice parlance are those debts where non-payment has priority enforcement consequences, namely the loss of your home, loss of liberty, so imprisonment, that's extremely rare, but it still is a possibility, or much, much more likely loss of utilities. So there are two priority debts in particular, rent arrears and council tax arrears. Council tax arrears are very unusual because in theory you can be imprisoned for non-payment. But really rent arrears, when we say priority debts, what we really mean is rent arrears, is that very real possibility of people being evicted. So we have this phenomenal shift away from this idea that people in debt are kind of irresponsible spenders, with shopping bags, the kind of tabloid image of the person in debt who is facing a multitude of consumer credit arrears, towards a reality in which huge, quite a significant proportion of the population are falling behind on their priority payments. And that has a really profound effect on what money and debt mean in everyday life. The second big shift was towards what we call negative budgets. The entire debt advice edifice relies upon the idea that I can bring you to a stable financial situation if we sit down together and we work on your outgoings and minimize them, and then we work on your incomings and maximize them, make sure you're getting all the benefits that you're entitled to. Theoretically, we should be able to get you to a stable budget. But the result of all of those welfare benefits changes is that even once you've done all of that work, the person still has a negative budget. They are still losing money from week to week, month to month. There's a lot of people in work, and I've got a chart for this here. So this is just representing the rise in negative budgets between 2019 and 2025. This is from Citizens Advice, but actually if you went a few years back, you'd see it's continually rising, particularly from about 2016, 2017. So you've got a large number of people, not just those who aren't in employment, but those who are working full time, whose budgets will never add up. And this has a really important effect, not just on debt advice, which is very difficult. You can't communicate with creditors, and yes, you have a stable budget, but also upon insolvency. Ideally, the kind of moral concept of insolvency is you've made some errors in the past. We'll do the insolvency process, and you can reset. You can reimagine yourself as a stable financial subject. This is impossible if you have a negative budget, because even once I make you insolvent, you will still be losing money. Your budget doesn't add up. So there's a shift towards this idea of insolvency as something cyclical. You do the insolvency, debt relief order of people without assets, and then when you're allowed to do one again, we'll do it again. Because there is no world in which you will ever be able to make enough money for it to all add up. You will always need debt and credit. You will always be in debt because that's the only way you're going to meet your essential outgoings. So I'm going to come back to those themes because there are a few ways in which, particularly drawing on the work of Adkins, Fiona Allen, Martin Koenings, Cooper, and others, there are, I think, some important implications for that in terms of how we conceive of debt. Just another chart to note is just about the importance of private renting within these shifts in terms of the increasing or the changing nature of debt and the role it plays in people's lives. There was a very important, the freezing of a local housing allowance, which is the part of your welfare benefits award that goes towards housing, was frozen, and that had a catastrophic effect on people's ability to meet their rental payments. Okay, there's a bit of gambling context as well. As I'm sure you all know, much like Australia, jurisdictions very intertwined. The UK has been on a rapid journey of liberalisation from the 1990s onwards, probably a little bit later in the UK because it's very much shaped by our 2005 Gambling Act, which itself really strongly represents the new Labour third way approach, this idea that we can generate, we can unleash this sector and the economic regenerative power it contains by reforming the subject. This whole sector has previously been considered in terms of vice, in terms of criminality. We need to make it positive. We need to recognize that people are responsible and capable of managing their own gambling problems, and there are really significant, economic regenerative effects that can be harnessed by liberalizing the gambling sector. So this was the kind of dominant philosophy of the new Labour administration, around 1997 to 2010. And I think gambling actually more than any other sector, particularly more than like alcohol, really, what's the word, reflects that political philosophy. Machine gambling in the UK has, until relatively recently, a few years ago, been dominated by FOBTs, fixed odds betting terminals, so machines offering games like roulette. There's been quite significant regulatory changes, mainly around the stake limits. The impact of that change in the stake limit has been a shift in the types of games that are offered on the machines. It's also been a shift in the types of high street establishments, which kind of shift towards high street casinos rather than betting shops. In terms of online, like here, the UK is very much a world leader in terms of the sophistication and penetration of its online gambling products. It's worth noting the extent to which the UK is an exporter of gambling harms as well. Our big, the operators that make up what we would term, Markham and Young term big gambling in the UK are really significant world exporters. And then I think we do miss a lot of the impacts of gambling if we only think of it as a domestic issue. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but you don't need to be told the significant relationships between gambling and debt, particularly as we have an increasing number of consumers being involved in online gambling, which I'm going to come back to. So, my kind of the key argument for the book that's represented in the title is that a lot of the work on debt and power that's been written in this period, and particularly written about austerity, misunderstands the extent to which the temporal schedules of priority debt repayment actually represent people's lived experience of debt. And I think the key person here is Lazaretto. So if you've read or looked at Maurizio Lazaretto's 2 books on debt, The Making of an Indebted Man and Governing Through Debt, there's this really, powerful idea that the defining power relationship in modern neoliberal economies is the creditor-debtor relationship. And what defines that relationship is the capture of time. It is the capture of time as uncertainty. The idea that you could walk out of your house and decide, what shall I do today? Shall I go to work? Shall I not go to work? Should I look for more employment? Should I not? Maybe I'll go on holiday. All of that is taken away by the creditor, who demands that you meet the temporal cycles of your debt repayments. That time as the potential for something new to happen is seized by the creditor. And Lazaretto expands, it's not just about consumer credit relationships, it's about a whole range of relationships, but that's the core of it, is that creditor-debtor relationship that is about the capture of time. And there's a lot of work about debt, in the UK that assumes that to be true, that you've got these enormous numbers of people who are locked into priority debt repayments. And this is particularly the case if you're in a court-agreed payment. So let's say you already had rent arrears, you went to court, you made an agreement in the court for a fixed schedule of repayments. It's really, really important that you stick to that, otherwise you'll be evicted. There's an assumption that that actually represents how people live. And what that misses out is the importance of consumer credit, talk about gambling as well, as an interruption to that. Because it was always my kind of observation, particularly in advice services and just walking around town, that the industry that knew very, very well what it felt like to live with, or to live a life defined by priority debt repayments, was the consumer credit industry. And I'm going to just show you this advert. Bright House are defunct now. They're one of a number of consumer credit providers in the UK that were kind of regulated out of existence by our Financial Conduct Authority. They offer hire purchase agreements, but you can't see it. Certainly those of you in the room can't see it, it's much too small. But the tagline here is choose your moments, as a way of selling home entertainment systems on hire purchase agreements. But the idea being, have a moment of your life that is not defined by this, that is not defined by this deadening cycle of debt repayment. And consumer credit understands that really well. You don't want your life to be like this. You want to be able to buy your children an Xbox. You want to be able to go on holiday because that is the one moment in which you can imagine a life that is not defined by debt repayment. So what those approaches fail to represent are the ways in which these same households maintain or really need this hopeful imaginary of intimate relationships that work, that might exceed those rhythms of debt repayment. And I think there's a failure to understand within academia and elsewhere why households, despite these kind of very, very serious debts, continue to get themselves into more and more consumer debt to pay for things like Christmas or holidays, because on the surface, those seem entirely irrational. And yet those are the things that actually give you the sense that you are a good parent, or you are providing for your children, you are providing them with the things that they need to believe in this as a family. So the really notable, and I don't know if I've mentioned it here, it might be on another slide, the really notable exception to this is Ryan Davies' work, who I draw on all the time. Ryan's written a book last year that's fantastic. But it's for this reason that I emphasize a cycle of debt, this movement between discipline and despair, hope through consumer credit, and then greater binding into systems of restriction, credit referencing, but other systems as well, which I'm going to talk about in a second, particularly open banking. There are two industries that understand extremely well this desire to imagine a life beyond the cycles of debt repayment. As I say, one of them is consumer credit and the other is gambling. So, and it's always, I find it remarkable how much the gambling advertising resembles consumer credit advertising. In its message, imagine a life that is more than what it is right now. I mean, maybe that sounds like all advertising actually, but there are particular similarities between them. So I've highlighted the 365 advert. It's never ordinary. These are adverts that emphasize extraordinary things happening in everyday life. And then I've got a gala advert. So if you spend a lot of time watching daytime TV, you'll see huge numbers of gala, bingo ads, which again are about inject a little bit of joy into the everyday moments in your life. Okay, I did talk. How many for time, Steve? Okay, so I'm not going to cover everything in this slide. That's 10 minutes to go, right? Two books that I absolutely love at the moment: Gerda Reith's book about history of gambling and Carl Vennelin's work on history of credit. But it really strikes me how similar the two histories are, how both histories are very much bound up with the taming of chance and the development of the science of statistics in order to harness and discipline this force of chance. I'm going to leave that there. I'm not going to go into that too much. It's a slight aside. But my interest in this now is about the ways in which the shifts to digital monies, and particularly two aspects of it that I'm going to talk about through Zalitzer and Keith Hart, the way in which digital monies are necessarily plural, and the way in which they leave a memory or a kind of memory trail, are changing these relationships between debt, money, and financial subjectivity. I've got 3 quotes from my research, just as an indication of the different roles that credit referencing plays in people's lives. In as much as credit referencing was at the time that I was doing this research, this was the dominant way in which people's previous financial actions were determining their future possibilities. That temporal framing is much further expanded now. The first of which was of seeing credit referencing as a disciplining force. This was someone saying they were desperate to pass on to their children the importance from an early age of disciplining themselves in order to achieve strong credit referencing, something I'm sure you all, or a narrative I'm sure you all know very well. And the second was someone describing credit referencing as a kind of reflexive emotional crux. This was someone who was really into their Experian app and was, despite, in a way that was almost completely divorced from their actual debt issues, was using the green colors on their Experian app as a way of telling themselves that they were doing fine, and was finding this really useful, actually, as a way of kind of staying stable in the present and having hope for the future. the third and kind of the kind of form of subjectivity that I'm going to come on to in a second, and I'm not sure actually you get it from the quote that I've chosen here, but was someone that was involved in really creative ways with managing what the different companies that to whom they were in debt, how I'm not putting this very well, the extent of the amount of credit available that they had through each of these different companies. And what she's expressing here is that she didn't want to put one of her catalogs into her insolvency, which you have to do. When you go insolvent, you do have to declare all of your debts, but they really tried not to declare one of them because they knew that that catalog was able to offer them a large amount of credit. So when they say they had nearly £2,000 on it, they don't mean they actually had £2,000. They mean that that catalog was open to offering them £2,000 in further credit. So they were involved in quite a creative way with managing all of the different creditors that they had in terms of the credit that they would offer to them. So the two theoretical frameworks that I draw on a lot, or three theoretical frameworks, to understand this are Zelitz's, which you may know all of these really well, we're going to go through them anyway. Viviana Zelitz's emphasis on differentiated ties, Keith Hart's work on money as memory, and then finally the emphasis on speculation in Adkins and Kerning's. So apologies if you know this wonderfully well already. Viviana Zelitzer in The Social Meaning of Money and Purchase of Intimacy emphasizes the ways in which people have always been involved in a kind of moral earmarking of their monies. I'm going to talk about the cashless debit scheme in a moment. But what the cashless debit scheme represented was an attempt to use digital money to impose a form of earmarking determined by neo-paternalist forces within welfare agencies. And then, as I'm sure you know, in The Purchase of Intimacy, she moves on to talk about the kind of necessary intertwining of money and intimate relationships, emphasizing this connected lives approach. And I think this is really important when we think about not only the way that people use digital monies to carry out similar earmarking, but the ways in which they resist or are unable to resist the imposition of moral earmarking from welfare agencies and states. It's interesting that she only has a passing interest in illicit money. Illicit money is a key part of my book, but I also think it's often under theorized and under considered the importance of criminal monies and how people interpret and use the monies that they gain through, for example, small-time drug dealing. The other key theoretical foundation is Keith Hart's work on money as memory. Hart takes a very different approach to Zimmel. If Zimmel's kind of the foundation, and so much obviously the sociology of money, Zelitz is really critical of Zimmel's tendency towards seeing money as abstraction. Keith Hart says, no, this is really important because what money does is it forms a temporal foundation or kind of enduring temporal foundation to fragmented and momentary relationships. And that Hart sees money as a form of remembering. And what I think is really, really important as we move into a world of cashless technologies is the ways in which these form different types of memory and how those memories are mobilized. I am particularly interested in the ways in which they're mobilized by policing and security services. When you carry out a financial transaction today, what latent potential does that have for future criminalization? I think that's a question that's changing profoundly. So just some examples of that, money as memory. Any peer-to-peer payment we make, obviously whether that's through M-Pesa or Venmo, PayPal, contains a digital memory that will endure in specific ways. There are a couple of papers that Burroughs and work I'm sure you know very well about the relationship between open banking and tenancies. What's interesting is how this memory, the memories of financial transaction, can become visible in different ways. A little slide just to emphasize, this is about money and the financial data generated and how those are incorporated into policing and security services, actually framed still by increase in surveillance powers post 9/11, but I think it's becoming transformed beyond recognition in an era of digital monies in ways that we're not really engaging with enough. So a few authors to point to: Sarah Brain, who's done work mainly in California, and about the incorporation of Palantir systems into policing. Palantir are quite, aggressively promoting their products to our Department for Work and Pensions to perform kind of similar functions around the gathering of data, and maybe more importantly, data matching. Hadjimateo and Fussy done work in police forces in the UK. What I found really interesting about those studies is that we always have this, Sam has this assumption, being still framing so much of my thinking around the postscriptum and societies of control, that all of these systems are about prediction. They're about prevention, about, how can we gather up data to prevent things happening before they happen. But Hadjimateo and Fussy put this quite explicitly, that these systems they are transforming policing, but not towards prevention. What they're doing is encouraging police forces at all levels to gather as much data as they can. And I think it's Sarah Brain actually, or I forget which of the papers it is, but there's a net widening effect that anyone who's even vaguely involved with policing is now incorporated into this system, and that itself becomes a site for risk, determining risk and suspicion. Even if you've been given a witness statement, you are now in the system, and that might be deemed as a kind of risk factor. But it's not about prevention, it's about gathering up data for future investigations and to justify future interventions. So this data carries a latent potential for something to happen in the future. And this is really profoundly affecting things like suspicion. Whereas previously there would have to be reasonable grounds of suspicion to carry out an intervention, you don't need that anymore because the data's all there to justify whatever it is you want to do, intervening in someone's life, stop and search, those kinds of things. And sorry, coming back to money, there's financial data isn't being incorporated in a huge way, but it's slowly becoming that. And I think we're rapidly entering into a time when all financial data will have that latent capacity for future criminalization. So the last kind of theoretical frameworks that I draw on a lot, so obviously this focus on speculation, Elisa Adkins, Fiona Allon, Linda Cooper, and Martin Koenings. These are predominantly studies in feminist political economy, which are linking, the kind of macro changes in the packaging, marketing of debt securities to changing household practices. The key point here, and I'm sure you all know this, is about how changes in markets generate the everyday temporal rhythms of household life, including payment, non-repayment, employment, unemployment, meeting or missing payments. Adkins focuses a lot on flexible mortgage contracts and how these enable new forms of time to be pulled and gambled upon and so on, to become the raw material of financial accumulation. So he focuses a lot on Paul Langley's work on financial subjectivity. He focuses, this is around the time of the crisis, on this figure of the revolver, of the person who is enticed into being able to manage their multiple debts, to move debts around and manage the risks and opportunities that different products are offering, as well as Wilson's work on mammopreneurialism, this idea that we all need to become entrepreneurs of our own lives. But the key thing that work has led me to is to emphasize this, this focus upon the speculative desire to mobilize alternative imaginaries of the family, of this changing role that consumer credit plays, no longer simply, enabling consumption, but enabling the speculative imagination that this is a life that works amidst a set of kind of non-securitized debt repayments, particularly to the government. You have the consumer credit industry offering people a way of speculatively throwing themselves forward to imagine that this relationship, my role as a parent is actually functioning. So I think that importance of speculation can't be underestimated in understanding how people actually relate to money and debt. I've wildly run out of time, haven't I, to do my case studies, so I'm going to do them very briefly. The first, as I've mentioned a few times, and I draw on this really heavily, is the changing capacities of money to restrict immoral payments. And the key, really extraordinary example of this is the cashless debit card in Australia, which was focused primarily on First Nations groups It built upon, moralized ideas, class and racialized ideas shared across multiple jurisdictions about the intergenerational reproduction of poverty through poor consumption choices. But what's really interesting about the scheme is that the payments were still presented as money. So they were still presented as holding those capacities of money, if we go back to Zimmel or Marx, of money as a general equivalent. This is, the money that sets you free, whilst at the same time bearing these restrictions that this is money that can't be spent on these seemingly immoral goods. As I'm sure you know, so key effects of the scheme are to disrupt people's existing forms of earmarking and budgeting. And I can't emphasize that enough, that what people need more than anything else is not financial literacy, is not financial education, is definitely not financial inclusion. They often need to be left alone to budget and organize their payments in ways that make sense for their own emotional attachments. And the CDC was a really good example of something that profoundly disrupted that. What's interesting to me is that it used the capacities of financial technologies to do that. In the UK, there's this, one of the spheres in which this is being discussed is in the development of our central bank digital currency, the digital pound. And the Bank of England has been really active in saying this isn't about restricting payments, this isn't about developing a future in which welfare benefits payments won't be able to be spent on this and that, as particularly Big Brother Watch are claiming. But the capacity will be there, and this is entirely speculative, but I would see no political pushback to that kind of implementation. The DWP is proposing to have access to people's bank accounts for the purposes of restricting capital fraud and overseas fraud. There is very little political pushback to these forms of financial experimentation on already vulnerable groups, namely those, welfare benefits claimants and those subject to immigration procedures. That's my first case study that I write about a lot. The other is about kind of challenger forms of risk determination, which are particularly organized around buy now, pay later. Steve and I did a little bit of work that we need to continue on emerging engagements with buy now, pay later. But the one that I think is absolutely fascinating is WeChat in China. Considering how dominant, how wildly sophisticated the WeChat and Alipay QR code payment systems are, it's extraordinary that there's very little written about them. And what is written about them is often mixed up with this kind of illusion of a social credit system. Ortiz is a wonderful piece about WeChat and Alipay. What I'm particularly interested in are their lending functions and how the determination of risk within their lending functions is tied up with communication. So WeChat is the dominant one of the two. They control most of the payment market. They developed this buy now, pay later function that uses the data that they have. They're the equivalent of WhatsApp. So it's using an extraordinary suite of or breadth of communication data in order to determine risk. And again, as we start to see emerging forms of credit that seek to operate outside of the traditional credit referencing system, most of which are offering to use broader ranges of data in order to determine the risk that you pose, not only to lenders, but to other sectors as well, employers and landlords. Again, Roger, the work lots of you have been doing on open banking and landlords in the United Kingdom shows that there is a really growing market for determining risk through access to people's financial data rather than using the traditional credit referencing system. So what I'm going to do actually is move on to, presuming I've only got a few minutes left, I'm going to move on to my final two slides. So my last few slides are about gambling. And the particular thing that, as I say, I'm fascinated in with gambling is that in as much as this, as a practice, it is so dissonant or so different to this idea of a desired financial subjectivity as a kind of disciplined investor, of someone who manages their investment, turns themselves into a citizen investor and in a disciplined way manages their investments and so on. Gambling sits in such contrast to that. It's fascinating to me, UK and Australia particularly, how central the industry is to our political economy, which doesn't make sense if it's, if it's something that's kind of an aberration within this dominant mode of financial subjectivity. So I love the one author that I think really engages with this is Fiona Nicol. Again, I know lots of you have engaged with her work, and it'd be really interesting if you can have other ideas or other perspectives for me to draw on. Fiona Nicol's work, her argument about this concept of phenopower is that people are being encouraged to manage the relationship between gambling and investment. And her kind of very critical take on a lot of gambling research is that the figure of the problem gambler is extremely useful to the state and the gambling industry as the kind of reverse image of the disciplined investor, the disciplined subject, financial subject. And that it plays this useful role. If you can demarcate a kind of couple of gamblers that are the bad gamblers, then that plays a useful role in encouraging people to be disciplined financial subjects. I find that fascinating. I think there's a real truth to that. I'm also drawn to the argument, and I take this mainly from Martin Koenig's definition of austerity, as austerity, the subject that lacks austerity is the subject who is deemed to insufficiently mobilize the existing resources they have in order to manage their debt repayments, who insufficiently draws on their resources to gain new forces of credit, but also bears the consequences of their failed speculations. And I think there's something in that with gambling that I can put it on my final slide. I find it extraordinary there's such an enticement to gambling. It's so central to our model of political economy that I think my argument is that as we develop these increasingly dynamic, as money increasingly generates more and more forms of data, it has an increasingly powerful effect on what we are able to do in the future. There's an increasing extent to which people are forced to bear the burdens of their failed speculative investments, including gambling. I think gambling plays a really important role there, again, in presenting this model in which you have failed, and you will bear the consequences of your previous failure. As you can hear, this is where I'm a little bit unclear, but I think I do think there's a really profound question to be asked about why is gambling so dominant, given that it is so different to the forms of financial subjectivity that we would otherwise determine as central to our political economy in the UK and Australia. And I do think that there's this idea that it's not that you failed by gambling, but you will bear the consequences of your failed speculative investments. So some final points, bringing these things together about digital financial technologies, power and debt. I think what digital financial technologies are doing is enabling states, particularly through their administering welfare agencies, to dictate forms of financial earmarking whilst retaining a model of money as universality. I think this, obviously the cashless debit card is a really good example of that, but we're moving towards that in the UK as the DWP gains more and more power to access people's financial information and determine what is and isn't acceptable financial consumption. Secondly, to form specific forms of social memory that exist as a form of latent criminalization and binding. I love Foucault and Healy's book, Ordinal Society, but one of the key points that they make in that book is that there is no option of excluding yourself. Actually, one of the, when the police are looking for evidence, they draw on a lot of financial evidence to place someone in a particular place, but also to determine where the funds came from for particular forms of consumption. I've got a lot of thoughts about, why people who are involved in low-level criminal activity organize their money in particular ways in order to evade these kinds of surveillance. But what's interesting is one of the key kind of forms of suspicion is if you have no digital trail, if you can't show how you bought something, that is a sign of suspicion in itself. So it's not like you can decide to just pay with cash and live outside of the system of money as a social memory. That is itself deemed to be a form of suspicion. Sorry, it's one of the key points Foucault and Healy make in that book. There's an increasing extent to which digital financial technologies are being used to orient people towards speculative financial practices. And more importantly, in my view, to being immediately bound to the failures of those speculations, where those speculations go wrong. And that's where I think gambling plays this really important role. And then echoing Nicol, there's this injunction to be able to manage the boundaries between investment and gambling and again to bear the consequences for when this fails, and those consequences are enduring. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Steve.
So we'll take some questions from the room, and I've got some comments online. Anyone want to go first? Yeah, Julie.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed that. There's so much in it, so many ideas. So I guess like one thing that I kind of honed in on in this kind of context of financial governmentality, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about the role of the Citizens Advice Bureau people. Because if I'm looking at like there's all of these kind of systems that are imposing certain logics on people and pushing people in various directions. The Citizens Advice, like they're essentially my understanding is that some of them are volunteers and they're helping people through these impossible, intractable cycles of, debt insolvency. Are they like, what is their involvement in that? Are they sympathetic? Are they disciplinary? Are they looking the other way when someone's doing some kind of like, you know, petty drug dealing kind of situation? Are they recommending the kind of grey welfare state? Like, are they telling people to go to fringe lenders as a lender of last resort? Like, what are they kind of doing to manage this impossible position that they're in and their clients are in?
Yeah, I mean, I've got so much to say about that, and it's also about my own relationship with the service. So, my I wrote a piece in 2019, which was very supportive of the role that Citizens Advice plays in those respects, particularly when it comes to managing the anxieties around debt. And then my friend and colleague Ryan Davey, kind of portrays this as like a really that's failing to engage with all of the kind of critical points that we can make about the role the service plays, and he's absolutely right. I think that one reason I think about it recently, there's a section in The Social Meaning of Money, the Zalitzer book, where she talks about, this is in the 1920s, a kind of welfare officer who's telling someone off, who's telling this mother off because she's bought shoes for her child. And the welfare officer is saying, look, you don't need to buy shoes because we buy the shoes. You don't need to, it's a waste of your money. And the mother says, but if I don't buy the shoes, then the child will think that I don't do anything for them. They'll think I'm a failed mother because I'm not doing these essential things like buying shoes. And it really made me think of the debt advice. That's what the whole edifice of debt advice is, about telling you what's unnecessary. You might think that buying shoes is necessary in terms of your image of yourself. I'm telling you it's not, and it's a waste of money. Not that that's not a good example in this context, but there are certainly aspects of that, of a kind of a disciplining the subject and telling them, no, your understanding of money in this respect is wrong. And one way in which that really profoundly shifted was that it used to be that clients would come in and say, no, I'm not going to do that because it would affect my credit rating. I'm not going to stop repaying this consumer creditor, even though you're telling me that my council tax is more important, because my credit rating is more important to me. That emotional attachment to credit rating is more important than the kind of very real thing of being sent to prison for non-payment of council tax. And the advice response was always, no, your credit rating is completely irrelevant in this context. And then over the years, they were absolutely right. Over the years, credit referencing, the impact of credit referencing has spread far beyond lending, to the point where if you're applying for a job, that they might also draw on Experian or the other credit referencing services. So that client was completely right to say, actually, emotionally, this is more important to me, and I think it's more impactful over the long term. But the kind of disciplinary response of the service was always, no, these are the things this is how you need to manage your money. You said about criminal, I've got a lot to say about the criminal side of it as well, because I think there's again, in kind of distribution of monies and earmarking of money, very extensive people involved in low-level criminal activity understand very well how they need to manage their monies in order to evade particular forms of financial surveillance that an advice service wouldn't know or tell you the wrong things. Yeah.
Yeah, your point there about the use of credit scores and kind of reverse engineering what they mean is going to be increasingly a common form of discipline. I mean, it's essentially what Palantir does. It goes into places, it has existing data, it kind of finds all the connections to it, and it kind of essentially makes up some kind of, essentially reverse engineers a disciplinary regime to look back on people in the here and now and then enforce various forms of discipline on them. So the mission creep of these things is, you know, we all enter into these kind of contracts every day with these platforms that we sign up for, but the rules change and the data disappears and goes elsewhere, and we have no control over that in terms of regulation in the future. And I think in our work across fintech, there's going to be a kind of key thing we're going to look at over the next few years and the way these kind of things interact, and particularly with your connection with the gambling. Julia Coffey's got a comment here, and it relates to the gambling studies conference that we went to last week. It was kind of a reaction to our work, but also a lot of the themes that came up about gambling through the week. So she says, I'll just read this out. Credit services gambling seem to offer the fleeting promise of a survivable life through momentary relief, fun, hope, optimism. The possibility of a good life sits in direct contrast with the failed speculator that you were kind of talking about and the failed indebted subject. It feels like the latent punishments through financialization, control societies are going to be harsher than ever. Much of the discussion in gambling last week, throughout the day about gambling specific studies, people in the room were bringing up hope and optimism all the time of why people do it, in the realm of these broader, negatives of kind of what's going on in the world, cost of living crisis. These things kind of relate to kind of people being able to sustain themselves now by having some kind of hope into the future. What's interesting too, we've been doing stuff about like how maybe gambling is a part of a broader speculative subjectivity.
Yeah.
I know you've heard me talk about that before. That like in all the things that we're exposed to from an early age, why wouldn't we have a gambling orientation towards life? You know what I mean?
I do.
Just to see what you think about that.
Yeah, I really because as we've spoken about, and I need to get Julia to, if you've got that written down, Julia, that's wonderful. That can be the playable. So I really love Thomas Raymond and Oliver Smith's work on. They got extraordinary field work on online. The kind of penetration of online gambling, mobile gambling products into the everyday, but they take a very different view. For them, it's about trauma and it's about resolution of previous trauma, which I don't think quite gets there. I'm much more similarly drawn to, Lauren Blant's framework for understanding this and the need to stay within the orbit of the thing that's offering you that momentary release.
Yeah. Because I suppose it relates to what you said earlier about like the figure of the problem gambler is actually a problem to fix gambling, because in Australia only 5% of people who gamble are problem gamblers. Yet like a huge percentage now of the population gambles on a regular basis. It's not a kind of pathological health risk for most people, but more and more people are dedicating chunks of their finances towards this practice as it becomes normalized. So treating it this kind of risk all the time, and I know this is kind of in your work, is actually one of the key problems with addressing it as a kind of social issue. In Australia, we had a Prime Minister get elected promising to stop ads, gambling ads to kids. 6 months into their second term, meets with key gambling industry figures. A week later is essentially rehearsing gambling industry talking points in Parliament. Just completely kind of normalising this stuff. So yeah, I really kind of take the earlier point about the way that the gambling industry loves the figure of the problem gambler. We know that they target them, but they love the politics of kind of focusing on that 5%. Because at the moment, they're kind of actively targeting everyone else, including targeting poor women. And in our work, we've seen now that like 30% of 18 to 30-year-old women have a gambling app on their phone. So I suppose what I'm asking you here is what's the broader implication in this in terms of the way that finances have become fintech and normalized through the phone, and how are people going to be able to kind of deal with this in the future in terms of their daily financial practices in the broader realm of a kind of ordinal everything data society? How are people going to be able to manage this?
Because two things to say, and I'm not sure they neither of them directly answers the question. The first is the dangers of presuming that the answer is to exclude oneself, because there are very good reasons. I work a lot with Gamban, and obviously on a personal level, there are really important reasons why you would implement GamStop or Gamban, which are the services to do that. But the really profound flip side of it is that you're identifying yourself as a risk. You're creating data that identifies you as a financial risk. And that could have really profound implications, not just for you if you want to come back into gambling, but in other sectors as well, because you're identifying you're leaving a digital record of yourself as someone with a gambling problem. And so the very systems that have been implemented to responsibilize the subject to recognize their own gambling problems are the same systems that then would exclude you from other, for example, tenancies as well. I mean, that's not an answer, but it's an indication of why that's a key question.
Yep.
The other thing, more practically, is that I've been doing this work with Citizens Advice, trying to develop tools and kind of materials for the advice services to engage with, be able to raise and engage with gambling. And my point in that is, look, the vast majority of people you're going to be dealing with would register nowhere on the problem gambling severity index. They're not going to be anywhere on that because it's just something they're doing all the time, when on the toilet or in bed or wherever. So you've got the danger is you only conceive it in terms of these high scores on the PGSI, rather than recognizing the real thing, the profound impacts that this is having on debt, on housing, on employment, on relationship issues. But again, the answer of how you provide meaningful advice to people that allows them to reflect upon their gambling issues and potentially change that. So.
Yeah, in the thing we did last week at the gambling thing, we did stuff with Rowan, who's a PhD that I marked last year, and he does stuff about kind of everyday gambling and gender. And he had this great example of a guy that was like put on a bet at a funeral, like in terms, and so increasingly at this conference, gambling was just seen as like an ambient practice that kind of happens detemporalized in day-to-day life, and that's essentially exactly what financial practices are. I mean, the example I use all the time is like when I get a car loan in 1993, I had to put a suit and go with my dad to the bank and like pretend I was a different person than I actually was to actually get a car loan. But now it's just like it's 24/7, and the temporality thing that you were talking about earlier on, I think, is particularly important. The way that both money is a memory of the past, but how that kind of impels us towards particular imagined futures is particularly an important part of how the financial subjectivity works. But also, I think, importantly, the distinctions within that subjectivity.
Yeah, maybe that's where on the incorporation of Bourdieu into this is where I need to talk to you more about, Steve. Yeah.
Has anyone else got a question for Sam?
I guess maybe on similar themes, I'm really curious about this idea of the boundary between investment and gambling, right? Like it's not really a practical distinction, right? It's a moral distinction. Like investment in gambling is a form of risking money for future money, but it's essentially that gambling is a bad form of doing it and investment is a good form of doing that. And I guess what I'm seeing culturally is like a collapse in the mechanisms or morals that allowed people to maintain that distinction. When so many investment platforms are offering more speculative cryptocurrency type things, right? And I was just reading this morning about Mr. Beast, right? Thinking of young people, because he's now obtained a financial service that's oriented towards young people.
Really?
Right? Yeah. And so his entire branding has been essentially, like loot boxing, gambling, game shows, giving away money, risking all your money. And now he's promoting this kind of, so he's adopted this investment app targeted at young people, and he's pitching it to the media as it's about responsible investment and compound investing and all that kind of stuff, compound interest. But it also offers all these really, crypto style products, and he's big in with Logan Paul and the kind of NFT sphere and all that kind of stuff as well. So it feels like particularly the kind of young men who are really in this space, the distinction between gambling and investment just doesn't exist anymore. And like maybe that's also because that the kind of investment you need to really get ahead these days needs to be more aggressive and more speculative. And so I'm just wondering, like, if does the distinction make sense? Does it make sense to operate as an individual using that distinction today?
Yeah, and this is what I'm looking forward to chatting to people more about, because clearly it's such a central, part of our cultural economy is this rapidly changing relationship between investment and gambling. And I definitely don't think that that idea of the gamification of investment gets anywhere near. I think they say collapse the distinctions.
Are you gambling on your university degree? Like that could
Yeah,
be
yeah.
seen for many students who gamble these days when coming and doing an art degree. It costs you so much, you've got to indebted.
We have students in our research basically saying that like HEX doesn't seem like an investment anymore. It seems like a risk. Yeah. Because you're going in tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, I can respond to some of that too, is that like in our survey data at the moment that myself, Julia, and Roger have been working on, we essentially have identified an array of like, there's 5 different kind of risk factor orientations towards fintech, but there's a kind of broader range of kind of user types that we're seeing that are both relating to actual financial position and gender. And we have this kind of somewhat illogical relations. Those in most financial stress are using fintech the most, are also most confident about their financial abilities and most positive about the future. If they're men, correlates slightly to women, but definitely is skewed by the male data, yeah. So men in particular think they're good with money, even if in a workshop they've just told us they lost $35,000 last year. So then there's this weird, definitely weird kind of bro-y correlation towards that kind of stuff. But we have some really interesting typologies that I can't wait to show you, Sam, about, we're not calling them typologies, about how that stuff works and the different orientations to those things, and how it maps onto different cohort groups. Yeah. Can we finish up there? Okay, so thanks a lot,
Thanks,
Sam,
Steve.
for your presentation.
everyone.
Very much enjoyed that, and yeah, enjoy your stay here. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Stays Online.